Hey everybody, welcome on back to the GSMC Football Podcast. Hope everybody had a great weekend as we are here on a Monday night talking about a few things here tonight. Before we go ahead and get in, I just want to, of course, thank you guys for tuning in to the show. We're brought to you, of course, by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. We'll be covering the top 5 coaches of all time as well as top 5 dynasties of all time. And make sure that you stick around for later in the show, and we're going to be talking a little bit of college football. And there's a certain topic that came up a few days ago raised by Deion Sanders in regards to spring games. So we're going to talk a little bit about that later on in the show. But before we get started, I would like to ask that you guys like and follow the show, as always. If you got a question during the show that you want to share or just a comment that you want to share, definitely type that into the super chat. Your input is a big part of what makes this show great, and we thrive on your energy and your insight. So whether it's a quick comment, a thoughtful question, or just an opinion that you want to share, don't hesitate to drop it in the chat. Now, if you want to make absolutely sure that your message stands out and gets featured on the show, there's an easy way to do that. You can just hit the super chat feature and just click the $ at the bottom of the chat box to send in your super chat. This guarantees that your message gets on the air, and it's also a fantastic way to support our channel. So we rely on your support to keep bringing you the sports content that you love, and we appreciate every single bit of it. So go ahead, let us know what you're thinking, hit that super chat button, and let's keep this show interactive and exciting. And if you prefer, you can also go to the GSMCsports.net website to tip, donate, and leave a comment or a question there. We couldn't do what we do without your amazing support, so we're so thankful to have you guys as part of our community. And once again, that link is GSMCpodcast.net. All right, so let's go ahead and get into our segment here. As everybody, I'm sure, is very much looking forward to, I'm going to be talking a little bit about Aaron Rodgers and basically what is necessarily going on with the holdup here with this whole process. He's still, of course, making his decision. He met with the Steelers over the weekend, or on Friday, I believe it was, and sources told reporters that he was there for about 6 hours, met with some Steelers brass like Art Rooney, Omar Khan, Mike Tomlin, of course, and he also met with offensive coordinator Arthur Smith for a little while as well. No deal is in place right now, although they did offer one. Just no decision has been made as of yet. So there's no real movement in terms of Aaron Rodgers, because he's been pretty silent in this whole process. We haven't heard anything from him, just seen a couple pictures of him at the beach. That's pretty much it. He hasn't even made any appearances on the Pat McAfee show, which he usually is a regular every Tuesday on that show, but he hasn't appeared there yet, still making his decision. And it's basically coming down to either the Steelers or retirement, essentially. Don't think the Giants are going to end up with Aaron Rodgers when it's all said and done. They just signed Jameis Winston over the weekend to basically a backup contract. So it seems like they will either try and get Russell Wilson, or they're most likely going to try and draft a guy and just have Jameis there as, the guy to basically have him start, I'm assuming. Or, maybe they start the young guy depending on who they get. But we'll see when the draft comes in terms of that. But in terms of Aaron Rodgers, I'm just wondering what exactly is the holdup. And why I asked that question is not just to completely bash Aaron Rodgers or anything like that. But if you take a step back and just kind of look at his whole situation in general, he's a Super Bowl winner, 4-time MVP. He's accomplished a lot in the NFL. Has a lot of passing records and all that. So I'm just kind of wondering what exactly it is that he wants out of this potential final year in the NFL, because he could say that he wants a Super Bowl, but to be honest, and I think if you ask a lot of people in just the NFL community, fan bases, analysts, things like that, most people would say that even if Rodgers signs with the Steelers, they're not a Super Bowl team. I'm a Steelers fan, and I believe that they're not a Super Bowl team with Aaron Rodgers in the lineup. Maybe he could have some better success than Russell Wilson did, at least towards the end of the season, because Russell Wilson was overall pretty solid for the Steelers, apart from those final 5 games, and he was by all means not the only reason why they lost those 5 games and struggled so much. There were a lot of other factors that went into that, but Russ was definitely not great. He wasn't terrible, but he definitely was not spectacular either. And so that's kind of, that 5-game losing streak kind of set this whole, nonsense in motion of them, potentially trying to wind up with Aaron Rodgers. They didn't like the decision to start Russell Wilson that Mike Tomlin made in the middle of the season. There were a lot of people in that building that did not like that decision. That's why you heard Mike Tomlin in the press conference say that he was the lone wolf in the room. He was the only one who wanted it. And when Russell Wilson started out 3-0, having success, Mike Tomlin started to feel good about himself, and you started to hear him, in press conferences saying things like, "That's why I'm well compensated," and all of that, because things were going well. But then, the cracks started to show as the season went along, and that ended up, of course, 10-3 start ended up in a 10-7 record and a blowout loss in the playoffs. Not to mention, every one of the 5 games that they lost, with maybe the exception of the Cincinnati game, were all blowouts. The Cincinnati game, even though it was not technically a blowout in terms of the scoreline, the Bengals dominated that game, and it really could have been a lot worse than what it was at the end of the day. But so that kind of set the whole motion on why the Steelers even tried to pursue Aaron Rodgers. It's because I think they knew that they were not going to bring back Russell Wilson, and I believe that their original plan was to bring back Justin Fields, but a combination of, I think, Justin Fields not trusting the organization that he was going to get a fair shot at quarterback, and the Jets offering him more money at the end of the day, more guaranteed money. That just basically led to Justin Fields getting away from the Steelers, and now they're in this situation where they're waiting on a 42-year-old quarterback to make a decision, and if he doesn't, then I would assume they would draft the guy in the NFL draft. I'm not sure if they would go first round or not, just because there are a lot of other needs on this team, and really the year to get a franchise quarterback would ideally be next year. So I think a lot of the whole mindset or the whole thought process of this whole mess with Aaron Rodgers is they want to basically have a home run shot to try and win a Super Bowl with Aaron Rodgers, or at the very least win a playoff game, which is sad that the standards have gotten to the point where they're just hoping to win a playoff game. But that seems like what this move screams at you, is they're just trying to win a playoff game, because you're not winning a Super Bowl with this version of Aaron Rodgers, not with 42-year-old Aaron Rodgers. 10 years ago, hell, 5 years ago even, yeah, you could probably make that argument that Aaron Rodgers could still lead a team to the Super Bowl, but not now, not after an Achilles injury, not after 2 bad years with the Jets, and 42 years old. Whether I don't really care much how good he was in the past, because right now 42-year-old Rodgers doesn't do anything for you as an organization. And for Rodgers himself, I just don't really understand what his goal is here. What's his end game? Like, what is he looking for in the Steelers or in any team? Because the only 2 teams that are seriously being considered are the Giants and the Steelers. And I think everybody would agree that neither the Giants or the Steelers are a Super Bowl team or are a quarterback away from a Super Bowl run. So what is Aaron Rodgers' plan? Like, what is it that he wants out of this? If it truly is a Super Bowl, then I don't think it's in the cards, and I think he should just retire. If he's just looking to just play one more year just because he's a competitor and he just wants to play one more year, then I can almost make the argument for, fine, if I'm a Steeler fan, fine, sign him because you're going to get your franchise guy next year. If that's the goal, I don't like it, but that's kind of where we stand right now. I think the Steelers are ultimately going to try and look for their franchise quarterback in next year's draft, when the draft just so happens to be in Pittsburgh, which is the first time that has ever happened. So what better year to get your, essentially replacement for Ben Roethlisberger in the NFL draft that is being held in Pittsburgh. It's a perfect story, so maybe they're looking at that. Plus, the next year's quarterback class just so happens to be very, very good if all, scouting things are to be true and to be believed. There's guys like Arch Manning, there's Drew Aller from Penn State, there's Cade Klubnik. There's a bunch of other guys, that they could, look at possibly drafting, and maybe they have to, move up in the draft to get their guy, because if they sign Aaron Rodgers, it's just going to get them to another 9-8, 10-7 record, and maybe you squeak into the wild card round, but I don't think you go much further than that. Maybe you could make the argument Rodgers could win a playoff game, but it also depends on who they play and depends on where they have to travel. If they have to travel to, say, Buffalo or Kansas City or something like that, or Baltimore, I don't know. I don't think that, I don't think they would do very well in the playoffs. Plus, Steeler teams tend to always get worn down towards the end of the year anyway. So I just think that it's not going to end where Rodgers wants it to. He's not going to go out on the top of the mountain winning a Super Bowl in his final season. He's just not. Unless he wants to be the backup for Kansas City, he's not going to end his career with a Super Bowl, or the backup for Philadelphia, or any of those real Super Bowl contenders that are out there, not the Steelers, who were fake contenders last year and are not even in the conversation this year in terms of being contenders. And that's from a Steelers fan. So I feel like I am a very big Steelers fan, but I'm also a harsh critic when it comes to them. And a lot of Steeler fans feel the same way that I do about Aaron Rodgers. And that's the other reason why. Like, why would you want to come to Pittsburgh when I know he has to know that most fans don't want him there? And I know the ownership has to know that most fans don't want him there. So I don't really understand why this whole process is even happening. They need a quarterback, sure, but you've got Mason Rudolph. Just roll with him for a year, and maybe you draft a guy in the third or fourth round, and see what you might have with him, or maybe you trade for Joe Milton. I know that's been floated around a little bit as the weeks have gone on. Don't know if they'll actually do that. I know it's been kind of picking up a little bit of steam over the past few days or so with this whole quarterback nonsense. But the other thing is the Steelers did give Rodgers a soft deadline, and that is April 21st, and that is just a few days before the NFL draft. So that's their so-called deadline. I believe that they'd probably be willing to wait longer because they called it a soft deadline. I think that's plenty of time for him to make up his mind. I feel like if that is truly your deadline, if he doesn't have an answer for you, you got to move on. You can't just be like, okay, well, let's wait a couple more days and see if maybe he changes his mind in a couple more days. Like, no. If he doesn't have an answer by then, or before then preferably, but if he doesn't have an answer by then you got to move on. He's not the answer to begin with. The Steelers just need to bite the bullet and just accept the fact that this year is going to be a transitional year. They're not going to compete for a Super Bowl. They're probably not going to win a playoff game. They'll be lucky to even get in the playoffs, because I feel like the Bengals will be better, and the Ravens, of course, are the class of that division still. So, at this point, Aaron Rodgers, just, make a decision. This isn't a big, it's not a big, huge, you're not going to win a Super Bowl in Pittsburgh. So, he's a smart guy. I'm sure he knows that. So, I don't know. I mean, I just feel like this is just being drawn out and drawn out and drawn out. And it doesn't need to be. Just make a decision and let us move on. Whether it's with the Steelers, it's like what Cam Hayward says. Even if you want to be a Steeler, or you want to be a Steeler or not, that's the pitch. Like what Cam Hayward said. You want to be a Steeler or not. It's that simple. And if he has to think about it, what Mike Tomlin always says, I want volunteers, not hostages. Well, he doesn't sound like much of a volunteer right now. So, all right, well, we're going to get into the rest of our show, but before we do that, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back, and we're going to get into some history. It's going to be kind of a historical sort of show today. It's a slow, NFL news portion of the offseason, so coming up with some different topics here. But when we come back, we're going to be talking about the top 5 NFL dynasties of all time. So just stick with us. We will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
All right, guys, welcome on back to the show. We're going to get on into our next segment of the show, but before we do that, just want to remind you guys once again that if you have any questions or any comments, or if you want to contribute to the show in any way, you can just hit up the super chat button on GSMCsports.net and type down your question or your comment, and I will get to it as soon as I see it. So definitely do that if you get a chance to. So let's go ahead and get into the next portion of our show. And like I said, this is a pretty historical themed show tonight, and I was very interested in doing these segments because I love looking back at old NFL highlights and old NFL films highlights especially, and just looking back on all the greatest teams in the NFL over the years. And there's been some great ones. You know, we of course have experienced a relatively recent one with the Chiefs, you know, of course, chasing their three-peat and all of that. So let's go ahead and get into it. The first team I'm going to put on here, and you might just think I'm just being a homer here just by putting them as the first team I covered. But this, again, I'm not necessarily putting this in any particular order. These are just, you know, 5 of the greatest that I believe are. So let's go ahead with the first team that I have is the Steelers of the 1970s, coached by head coach and Hall of Famer Chuck Noll. 4 Super Bowl titles, of course, with guys like Terry Bradshaw, you know, on offense, John Stallworth, Lynn Swann, you know, all of those guys, Rocky Bleier, Franco Harris, you know, all those guys on offense, they're all Hall of Famers. And defensively, of course, they had the steel curtain defense, and that was the mammoth, you know, front 7 that the Steelers had with Joe Green, Ernie Holmes, Elsie Greenwood, Dwight White on the front line. And then, of course, at linebackers, you had Jack Ham and Jack Lambert, 2 Hall of Famers as well. And then don't forget about Mel Blount on the back end there. Legendary defense. And during the 70s, they were fantastic. They were the first team in NFL history to win win back-to-back Super Bowls twice. They were also the first team to reach 4 Super Bowls as well, and they were also the first team to win 4 Super Bowls in 6 years as well. So overall, during that 70s stint, the Steelers had a 99-44 record with 1 tie in the regular season, and of course, Super Bowl championship 4 times, and they were an outstanding team, legendary defense, you know, one of the more physical teams in NFL history. Chuck Noll was a no-nonsense kind of head coach, but he was a fantastic head coach, and it's a shame that I never really got a chance to watch him be the coach and watch those 70s teams, because that's a little bit before my time. But that's the one thing as a Steeler fan that, you know, I regret, even though there's nothing you can do to change something like that. But, you know, being born like in that 70s era would have been awesome, you know, to watch those Steeler teams as a big Steeler fan that I am, to watch them win 4 Super Bowls and just dominate the NFL during that time frame. It's, you know, it would have been really, really fun to see that. But just looking at all the old highlights is still, you know, a treat as well. It's a Hall of Fame, you know, team. Almost every single person on that team were Hall of Famers, you know. Despite what a lot of people in Pittsburgh may think of Terry Bradshaw, he was also a Hall of Famer, you know. And that offense was fantastic as well, but the defense was really what made everything tick. So they were definitely one of the teams, one of the greatest of all time. You could probably make the argument that they could be the greatest dynasty of all time, if not for what the Patriots were able to do in the 2000s, winning those 6 Super Bowls. Outside of them, I think that, they would probably be the one team that I would say franchise-wise probably be the best dynasty. Just those 6 Super Bowls is, a ridiculous feat, no matter how you might think of the Patriots overall. But we'll get to them in a second because obviously they're on this list too. But the next team that I have on here is the Cowboys of the 90s. They won 3 Super Bowls, 2 under Jimmy Johnson, 1 under Barry Switzer. Hall of Fame players like Troy Aikman, Michael Irvin, and Emmitt Smith. Emmitt Smith had the all-time record for career rushing yards for a while there, for like years and years and years he did. He was listed as you could make the argument that he's one of the greatest running backs of all time. Walter Payton is up there, obviously, too. Barry Sanders is up there. You're talking about like the greatest running backs of all time and everything like that. So a lot of great running backs, Gale Sayers, Eric Dickerson, all of those guys. But Emmitt Smith, he was right up there, and he stood alone for a while with that record. Jimmy Johnson, their head coach, like I said, he was the first coach to win a national championship and a Super Bowl. He won a national championship with the Miami Hurricanes, and then, of course, won 2 Super Bowls as the Cowboys coach before Jerry Jones sort of forced Johnson out because they had sort of a disagreement right before that season that they won in 95 when they won the Super Bowl with Barry Switzer. But Barry Switzer, like I said, he did end up being the coach that year, inherited an incredible team, and they won their 3rd Super Bowl of the 90s that year. And obviously, they would have probably won the Super Bowl if Jimmy Johnson was the coach of that team regardless. So, and they may have won more Super Bowls under Jimmy Johnson if they didn't have that falling out between Jerry Jones and Jimmy Johnson. Maybe they have more. Maybe they have the most Super Bowls of all time. Who knows? Because they have 5 now, and they've been stuck on 5 ever since that final Super Bowl win against the Steelers in 1995 when Larry Brown had those 2 interceptions returned for touchdowns on Neil O'Donnell. I remember very vividly that game. That was actually probably my first Steelers memory that I really truly remember was watching that game with my dad. I remember just sitting at the edge of the bed in their room, in my mom and dad's room, watching that game in 1995 and watching Neil O'Donnell basically make my dad have an aneurysm. And obviously it hurt watching it, but I didn't know the gravity of the loss, until, of course, I got older because I was just a kid back then. But that's just a fond little memory, but still sucks that they lost that game. But looking back on it now, I would love a Super Bowl appearance. Even if they lost, I would love to get there. It would suck to lose, but I would love to get there again, because that would mean that the team is moving in the right direction. So, and they're not. So, but I digress. The next team that I have on this list, like I mentioned briefly before, I have the Patriots of the 2000s era, and that is 6 Super Bowl titles that they won. That's more than any other dynasty in the NFL of all the teams. It's the same amount of titles as the Steelers have in terms of Super Bowl titles, but in terms of dynasty Super Bowls by one coach on one team, that's the most. So Tom Brady is widely considered the greatest quarterback of all time. He led the way for the Patriots for those 20 years or so that they were, dominating the league and winning Super Bowls. But he's got a Hall of Fame resume, or you could at least make the argument that he has a Hall of Fame resume in 3 different decades. He won a Super Bowl in the 2020s. He won a Super Bowl in the 2010s, or he won many Super Bowls in the 2010s. He won many Super Bowls in the early 2000s. If you take a look at all of his stats over those 3 decades, and even though I know the 2020s, he wasn't in the league that long in the 2020s, but still got a Super Bowl with Tampa Bay, during that time. So you could make the argument that he has that Hall of Fame resume in 3 different decades, which no other player could make that argument, because Brady has 7 Super Bowl rings, 1 with the Buccaneers, of course, and then 6 with the New England Patriots. And head coach Bill Belichick, also considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest coach of all time. So you definitely got to put him up there as one of the greatest. And during Tom Brady's 20 seasons with New England, along with Bill Belichick, But when those two were, partners and Brady was starting during those 20 seasons, their record was 249-75 in the regular season and playoffs. They had 6 Super Bowl wins, of course, 9 AFC championship appearances, and an unreal 17 AFC East titles. They won the AFC East in all but 3 seasons that Tom Brady was the starting quarterback of that team. So ridiculous longevity of that success too. So they were very good and arguably the greatest dynasty of all time. The other teams that I just have a couple more teams on this list here. The other team I have is the 49ers of the 80s and early 90s. Head coach Bill Walsh. He was the pioneer, the architect of the West Coast offense that you see in some teams across the league nowadays. His impact on the NFL just goes beyond how he built the 49ers dynasty. For as impactful as he was offensively with his offensive philosophy, his list of accomplishments really is incredible. If you take a look at the things that he did, he drafted Joe Montana, Ronnie Lott, Charles Haley, Jerry Rice, then identified Steve Young's talent and traded for him. And then, of course, Steve Young ended up winning the Super Bowl. But, he was one of the greatest head coaches of all time leading that team. And like I said, those Hall of Fame players that he was able to get through the draft and through trades, that's all Bill Walsh and that front office, of course, being able to do that. But he was a brilliant mind on and off the field in the front office. But he definitely was a big reason why they dominated the 80s and a short portion of the 90s. They won 3 Super Bowls under Bill Walsh before he retired, before the 1988 title that they won. George Seifert took over as the head coach, and he won the Super Bowl with Steve Young in 1989 as well as 1994. And during that 14-year stretch, the 49ers won a total of 5 Super Bowls, lost in the NFC Championship game 4 times, and posted a 159-56-1 record overall. So obviously a great team, great dynasty, definitely has to be put up there as one of the greatest. 5 Super Bowls total when you combine that whole decade. 2 different coaches, Bill Walsh, of course, leading the way for 3 of them, and then George Seifert winning a Super Bowl in 89 and 94 as well, before Steve Mariucci eventually took over as the head coach there. And they were still competitive going forward. Never won a Super Bowl under Mariucci, though, but, they were always up there, always in the playoffs and, championship games and all that. But the other team that I have on here, and it kind of goes without saying here, this team belongs on this list just because of the influence that their head coach ended up having on the game, one of the founding fathers of the NFL, and that is Vince Lombardi's Packers of the 1960s. And the Packers were a struggling team in 1959 when Vince Lombardi took over and transformed them into the dominant force that they ended up being. They won 5 league championships in 7 years. And keep in mind, this is before the AFL-NFL merger that was in 73, I believe, or 72. And they won championships in 1961, 1962, 1965, 66, and 67. So 2 years in a row they won NFL championships, and then a couple years off, and then 3 years in a row from 65 to 67 they won NFL championships. Won the first 2 Super Bowls as well in 1967. So the merger was in 67. So I apologize for that, but they won in 1967. That was Super Bowl I, and then 1968 Super Bowl II. And they were not officially called Super Bowls until Super Bowl III in 1969, but still counts as Super Bowl wins, though. So those dynasty years from 65 to 67, though, they just cemented their status as a dynasty, with those championships, those 3 consecutive championships running from 65 to 67. And, of course, Vince Lombardi's legacy and, just how great he was as a head coach. And that's why the trophy is named after him, because he's won the first 2 Super Bowls ever and is just a pioneer in this whole, league that we enjoy now. So one other team I'm going to put on there real quick, just before we end this segment, is a present and modern day team, and that is the Kansas City Chiefs. They've been to 5 Super Bowls since 2019, won 3 of them. And, of course, they had a chance for a three-peat this year but lost to Philadelphia. But they have an 89-23 record under Patrick Mahomes and head coach Andy Reid. And Mahomes has been to the AFC Championship game in 7 years as the starter. 7 straight years. Every year that he's been the starter, they've been in the AFC Championship game. That's how good and how consistent they are. And Andy Reid also is the first NFL coach in history to lead 2 different franchises in all-time wins. So obviously he's got to be up there as one of the greatest coaches of all time. They came the closest to anybody that, had a chance to three-peat in NFL history. Every other team had either lost the first round of the playoffs or didn't make it at all. So the Chiefs got all the way to the Super Bowl before they lost, their three-peat bid. So they've lost to just 3 different quarterbacks in the entire postseason as well. So Mahomes has lost to Brady twice, once in the playoffs, once in the Super Bowl, lost to Burrow in the AFC Championship game a few years ago, and then, of course, last year losing to Jalen Hurts. So the Chiefs definitely belong on this list as one of the greatest dynasties of all time, and it's still currently going. So they may add to this, before their time is up. So we'll have to see. But those are my teams, my dynasties. If you have difference of opinion or one that you want to add on there that I might have forgotten, then definitely let me know in the comments, and we can get going with a little conversation as well. So that's the segment for my dynasties. When we come back, we're going to keep going with this whole history theme, and now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the guys that we talked about in this last segment, but top 5 head coaches in the NFL of all time. So we'll take a quick break here, and when we come back, we'll talk about that. So stick with us. We'll be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
All right, guys, welcome on back to the show, and we're going to get right into our next segment here. We talked a little bit about dynasties in the last segment, and now we're going to talk about the guys that lead those dynasties. Top 5 head coaches of all time. And the first one that I have on this list, and again, this is like the other segment, not in any particular order. These are just 5 of the greatest head coaches of all time, in my opinion. So we're going to start with Bill Belichick. He is on this list. He has 8 Super Bowl titles as both a head coach and an assistant coach. He won 6 with New England and 2 as an assistant coach with the Giants. So 8 Super Bowl titles for Belichick. 3rd in the NFL in all-time wins with 302. He had 36 as the head coach of the Cleveland Browns before taking the job in New England and ending with 266 regular season and postseason wins overall for Bill Belichick. He's the only head coach with 6 Super Bowl wins with one team. So definitely a guy that is up there as one of the greatest, if not the greatest head coach of all time. You could definitely make that argument because that 2 decades of success that they had from the 2000s or early 2000s till later in the 2020s or early 2020s, that stretch of run that they had was just nothing short of remarkable. And they were one of those teams, much like how the Chiefs are kind of starting to experience now. They were one of those teams that people love to hate because they're just always in the end. They were always in the game at the end, always at the Super Bowl. It was usually the Patriots against somebody from the NFC. It just didn't really matter. Whoever won the NFC that year, it's just basically every year was just like, okay, so what team is going to end up playing the Patriots in the Super Bowl at the end of the year? That's kind of the way it went, for a good majority of Belichick's career in New England. Obviously, Belichick has moved on to college football, and he's the head coach of North Carolina, and, of course, Brady is retired and up in the booth. with Fox calling Super Bowls of his own. So, anytime you think about the Patriots, you just think about those 6 Super Bowl titles and that dominant run that they were on, where everybody hated them unless you were a New England fan, just because they were always so good. So obviously Bill Belichick's on my list, one of the greatest, if not the greatest coaches of all time. Another guy on this list is Chuck Noll. He was the assistant to head coach Don Shula when Don Shula was with the Baltimore Colts back in the day from 1965 to 1968, and then he was selected as the Pittsburgh Steelers head coach in 1969, ended with a 193-148 record as a Steelers head coach. That's just a few percentages over a 500 record, and that record may not seem amazing to people when you just look at it at face value, but they got off to a pretty rough start under Chuck Noll's guidance. They didn't really have a great team until a couple years ago once they drafted Joe Green. When they drafted Joe Green, that's when things started to turn for the Steelers, and the 70s was a dominant decade for the Steelers. They won 4 Super Bowls with Terry Bradshaw and that Steel Curtain defense, and he's one of only 3 head coaches in Steelers history as well. Of course, Bill Cowher and Mike Tomlin being the other 2, but he was the longest tenured head coach in Steelers history so far, being from 1969 to the early 90s. So well over 20 years he was the head coach for the Steelers and brought them from the dumpster to, what they are now today, as the standard being championships and all of that. Even though they may not have reached a championship or sniffed one in several years, the standard is always there. That's why you always hear Mike Tomlin say the standard is the standard. And even though he hasn't hit that standard, the standard he's talking about is expectations of Super Bowls each and every single year. So if it wasn't for Chuck Noll, the Steelers wouldn't have that mindset. Their organization wouldn't be as, successful as it has been over the years, if not for Chuck Noll. And, he's obviously a Hall of Fame coach, one of the best coaches of all time. That's why he's on this list. So the next guy that I have on this list is Tom Landry, and he was the head coach of the Cowboys from 1960 to 1988, 2-time Super Bowl champion, obviously a pioneer of the game as well. Won an NFL championship as an assistant in 1956 with the Giants as well, and he has an overall record of 270, 178, and 6. 4th all-time in wins as a head coach. Tom Landry, one of the greatest to ever do it, for sure. The other guy that I have on this list here is Bill Walsh, the 49ers head coach. Obviously, we talked a little bit about him in the last segment. Pioneer of the West Coast offense, like we said. Overall record, including postseason, has 102, 63, and 1. Won 3 Super Bowls with Joe Montana and Jerry Rice. And then in 7 of Bill Walsh's last 8 seasons, the 49ers had 10 or more wins each and every regular season, and they were in the NFC playoffs in each of those years. So Bill Walsh, of course, goes without saying that he is one of the greatest to ever do it. That 49ers team of the 80s and, of course, the early 90s, when they had those guys, even when, obviously Bill Walsh wasn't there when Steve Young won the Super Bowls, but if not for Bill Walsh, the 49ers don't get Steve Young to begin with, and maybe they don't win a couple more Super Bowls with him. And, maybe they're only stuck at 3 if, not for, or maybe they don't even have 3 if not for Bill Walsh. That's how great that team was, under his guidance. So he's definitely up there as one of the greatest of all time. The other guy that I have on this list is Andy Reid. And Andy Reid we talked a little bit about in the last segment as well. And he's the only coach, like I said in the previous segment, he's the only coach to lead 2 franchises in all-time wins, 6 Super Bowl appearances as a head coach, 3 Super Bowl wins, all with the Chiefs, and overall record, 301, 163, and 1, and that is including a 28-17 postseason record. He's been to the AFC Championship game in 7 straight seasons, and been to 6 Super Bowls, like I said, 5 Super Bowls as the head coach of the Chiefs, and 1 with the Eagles. And obviously the Eagles, the other team that he leads in all-time wins when it comes to head coaches. So Andy Reid definitely has to be up there as one of the greatest of all time. And he's still going, too, so he could add to that resume. He could add to his Super Bowl wins. Obviously he's going to add to his overall record because the Chiefs are going to be, a 10, 12, 13, 14 win team usually every year. So they're going to get at least above 10 or 11 wins every single year with that dynamic of Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid. They've been dominant together. And, of course, Travis Kelce on that team as well, even though Travis Kelce is kind of on the back end of his career now. But that time when Kelce was in his prime with Mahomes and Andy Reid, that was an almost unstoppable force, especially when they had Tyreek Hill, stretching defenses with his speed. They don't necessarily have the greatest offense anymore. Obviously, it's still good enough to get them to the Super Bowl like they were last year, but their offense has taken a dip or at least this past year it did. But, you never doubt the Kansas City Chiefs with Andy Reid and with Patrick Mahomes, because they will always be in the conversation for the Super Bowl every single year as long as those guys are together. They're just constantly, in there, constantly the guys that you have to overcome in the AFC to, get to the mountaintop or win a Super Bowl. Even in the NFC, a lot of teams feel like they have to beat the Chiefs, because that's going to end up being the team they face in the Super Bowl anyway, because the Chiefs just always get there. But we'll see what happens this year. They lost some players, and, I don't know, maybe we'll get a little bit of a Super Bowl hangover, as they were kind of exposed a little bit in that Super Bowl with not being able to control the pass rush of the Eagles. But, as good as a coach as Andy Reid is, you figure that he'll probably get something figured out, and they'll be better next year in that area, most likely. So the other coach that I have on this team, on this list, is Don Shula, and he is arguably the greatest head coach of all time. He's the all-time winningest coach, has the most wins out of any coach in NFL history, 328 wins, and a 328 and 156 and 6 record. That's 6 ties, and he won 1 Super Bowl with the Dolphins. But that Super Bowl that he won with the Dolphins, and he also had been to one with Dan Marino as well, but that Super Bowl they won in 1972, he became the only coach to ever coach a team to an undefeated season and win a Super Bowl in that same season. That is a record that is still good today. A lot of teams, they go on stretches of like 10-0, 11-0, and then you start to kind of wonder if that record is going to be broken. The Patriots came the closest with an undefeated regular season and then losing in the Super Bowl to the Giants. But nobody's been as close as the Patriots. Nobody else has finished a season with an undefeated regular season record other than the Patriots and the Dolphins. But the Dolphins were the only team in NFL history to actually finish the job and win the Super Bowl. So Don Shula, he's got to be up there. You don't get to the most wins in NFL history over a lot of legendary coaches, without being a legendary coach yourself. So he's up there for sure. He's Mount Rushmore. All of these guys, I believe, are Mount Rushmore of head coaches. Maybe you can add on another guy if you can find some more space on Mount Rushmore. If you think of one, Jimmy Johnson, deserves an honorable mention as well. He was a great head coach also, and probably could have won more Super Bowls if he were to stay with Dallas. So you got to add him in the conversation as well. Even though he's not technically on this list, he's definitely a guy that deserves to be up there, along with a lot of other coaches, that are great head coaches. And, this list is not to, dismiss any other head coach. It's just these guys are the greatest. Also, another guy that I really wanted to put on this list, but I didn't, is John Madden. And John Madden, great head coach for the Raiders, of course, great player as well when he used to play. But his thing is he was so, influential in the NFL, and really is a big reason why the NFL is where it is today, with his, his commentary that he had during the games after he had retired, and then of course the invention of the Madden video game that's still going strong today. And he's a legend of the game, and everybody misses John Madden. Everybody loved John Madden. He was great to just listen to on a Sunday. Knowing him and Pat Summerall, or him and Al Michaels when they moved to Monday night and Sunday night football. Those are great tandems in the booth, and I don't think we'll ever get somebody that can live up to that kind of combination, that color commentary that John Madden provided. Always, has those one-liners, those memorable quotes, so he was great and one of the greatest of all time for sure, and he bears mentioning, of course, on this list as well. So that covers it for that segment. When we come back, we're going to talk about a little bit of a way too early MVP candidate list. I'm going to list some guys that I think are probably going to be in the running this year for MVP. Obviously, like I said, way too early to be giving out awards because we haven't even got to voluntary workouts or mandatory workouts. So, but when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about that. So stick with us. We will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
All right, welcome on back to the show, guys. We're moving on to our next segment as we're going to be talking a little bit about some early predictions, early MVP candidates that I went ahead and listed when I was doing some research earlier on today. MVP candidates, obviously, last year, Josh Allen from the Bills won it with a fantastic season, and Lamar Jackson was up there as well, and there was a lot of argument that he should have won the MVP based on the numbers, but it ended up going to Josh Allen, and I honestly believe that had a little bit to do with people kind of not necessarily being over seeing Lamar Jackson win MVP. It's just that he had won it the previous year, and he had 2 MVPs already, and Josh Allen is a great quarterback that you feel deserves an MVP, and I feel like that went a long way into determining who the MVP was last year. Whether you think that's fair or not, I believe that that's kind of what happened. For me, some early MVP candidates, obviously, I got to put Josh Allen on there. He's the reigning MVP, and he had a tremendous year last year. You figure they're probably going to be better offensively this year. Not that they were bad last year, but they didn't necessarily have these huge big-name weapons that you always see, and they don't necessarily have that this year either, but they do have Josh Allen, and that's all that really matters. They got their run game going too, so last year they did get some run game going, so that will actually, of course, make it a lot easier on Josh Allen and give him more opportunities most likely, with people being more focused on the run than they used to. And, of course, Josh Allen has that ability to take off with his legs. He's ran for 50-yard touchdowns plenty of times in this league, and he makes these, backyard sort of plays. He always has reminded me of a Ben Roethlisberger, only, of course, Josh Allen is more gifted athletically, in terms of being able to run the ball, because Ben Roethlisberger was never the fastest guy. He could, get away from trouble because of how physical and how tough he was, but, he couldn't, turn on the speed boost or anything like that and really burn you for anything. Josh Allen can do that. Josh Allen has that ability as well as a cannon for an arm, so you definitely have to put Josh Allen up there as one of the candidates for MVP. And Lamar Jackson is the other guy that I have on here. Well, I have several guys, but he's the next guy that I have on this list. Lamar Jackson, 2-time MVP already, arguably could have won it, should have won it last year with his numbers. So he could end up with, way more than 2 or 3 MVPs by the time his career is over if he keeps at this pace, because he has grown an awful lot as a passer. When he first came into the league, he's always been electric running the ball and elusive running the ball and difficult to stop because of that, because he's so good at that. But over the years, he's gotten better and better at throwing the ball and reading defenses and putting it right where it needs to be. Obviously, it's helped that he's gotten better weapons over the years as well, and now he has Derrick Henry, and that takes more pressure off of Lamar Jackson. He can do more things through the air because people are so focused on Derrick Henry and how explosive he is and how he can just completely rip a game wide open with a long run or a vicious stiff arm. Now that puts more attention on Henry, less attention on Lamar Jackson, and Lamar Jackson can beat you both ways. He can beat you through the air, and he can beat you on the ground with his legs. He's one of the more elusive quarterbacks, probably the most elusive quarterback and electrifying running quarterback since Michael Vick. I'm a Michael Vick guy in terms of his ability on the field. You know, he was, regardless of what you might think of him off the field, just we're talking about football field stuff. And when he was on the field, Michael Vick was one of the greatest to ever do it. And Lamar Jackson, of course, has that record now that Michael Vick had for a while with the most rushing yards in a single season. I believe Lamar Jackson got that, if I remember correctly. But he's a great player and well deserving of an MVP. And I think he will be right up there in the conversation again next year. And obviously, the next guy that I have on this list is Patrick Mahomes. And Patrick Mahomes, he didn't have the greatest statistical year last year, but this is a guy that you never should count out because he is just straight up a winner, and he always has been his whole NFL career. And it would be foolish to disregard him in the MVP conversation because he is one of the greatest quarterbacks to ever do it, not just one of the greatest quarterbacks currently in this league, but you can't count him out. You always got to keep an eye out for Patrick Mahomes. He could, be middling through a game, and then all of a sudden you're half stepping or you fall asleep for a second, and he can beat you with a critical 20-yard run on a third down or something like that, or he gets you with, reading the defense and putting the ball right where it needs to be for a big play, or just getting down the field in 13 seconds and winning the game like he did against Buffalo a couple years ago. So he's a great quarterback, and this is a quarterback award. As much as I would love to give it to a guy like Saquon Barkley or Derrick Henry or a defensive player or anything like that, this is a quarterback trophy. It just is, as fair or unfair as that might be. That's just what it's proven over recent years anyway. Not that there hasn't been MVP running backs, because there has been, of course, with Adrian Peterson several years ago, but it's been mainly a quarterback award. You don't ever see receivers or defensive players or anything like that ever winning the award. So this is all a quarterback list, it just is. So the next guy that I have on this list is a guy who is now a Super Bowl champion, and that is Jalen Hurts. And Jalen Hurts, his stats last year, at least throwing the ball, aren't going to knock your socks off or anything like that, but what he's able to do running the ball, and he doesn't run it like Lamar Jackson does. He's more of a physical runner, and he gets a lot of his rushing touchdowns through the brotherly shove that they are now trying to ban, which I think is ridiculous, and I know we talked about that a few days ago on one of our shows, but that is just how effective he is. It's that play that everybody talks about, the brotherly shove, that's skill from Jalen Hurts too. His strength in his legs, being able to push the line and help push the line across, that's a big part of what goes into how successful that play is. Of course, the offensive line and then the push he gets behind him, that definitely helps too, but Jalen Hurts needs to be strong and needs to know how to execute that play as well, and he's very, very good at it. Had an absolutely tremendous game in the Super Bowl against the Chiefs. I believe it was 3 touchdowns running the ball. He had about 2 or 3 touchdowns throwing the ball. He had a crazy stat line, and I'm sure Eagles fans will correct me on that stat line. But he was fantastic in that Super Bowl, and he really has always been a solid quarterback. Even in his time in Alabama, he was good. Of course, he has been helped by having great coaching for most of his playing career. Of course, being at Alabama under Nick Saban, and then of course being drafted in Philadelphia. And, say what you want about Nick Sirianni, he's been to 2 Super Bowls, and he coached the best team in the NFL this year. And, he did a great job, so you got to give him credit for that. So Jalen Hurts is on there as one of my MVP candidates. Another guy that I have on this list, last guy I have on the list, is a guy that you could probably make the argument that he should have won the award over Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen last year, and that's Joe Burrow. And the reason why he did not win it last year, I believe, is because he was on the Bengals, and the Bengals missed the playoffs last year because they got into a hole and had to dig themselves out of it and weren't able to get into the playoffs at the end of the day. But it was by no fault of Joe Burrow. He was outstanding, had crazy stat line. I know we talked about the Bengals in depth before, but Joe Burrow is one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL, and I still believe he's the best quarterback in that division, just in terms of just pure quarterback, pure passing quarterback. Lamar Jackson, of course, can hit you both ways, but I think Joe Burrow is the best pure passer in that division by a long shot. And he, would have, who knows what kind of damage they would have made in the playoffs, last year if they were to get in. Their defense struggled, but did improve later on in the year. So by the time the playoffs were rolling around, the defense was actually playing pretty well in terms, if you just compare them to how they were playing early on in the year. I think they played very, very well towards the end of the year, and they could have carried that into the playoffs, and they could have done some real damage. They've beaten the Chiefs in the playoffs before in Arrowhead. So if they were to play the Chiefs last year, who knows? Maybe they beat them in that game. And maybe it's a Bills-Bengals AFC championship game. And who knows what happens there, But I think Joe Burrow absolutely should be considered. And he's going to be a little extra motivated this year because he got his buddies back. Both T. Higgins and Jamar Chase signed big offseason contracts, which is exactly what Joe Burrow wanted to happen. So you're going to have a happy and determined Joe Burrow to try and bounce back from that season that the Bengals had last year. So I would not be surprised if Joe Burrow goes off next year and actually ends up winning MVP. He probably should have won it last year, but like I said, he was on a team that did not play well as a unit collectively throughout the course of the year, and they put themselves in a hole and ended up missing the playoffs. So he deserves mentioning in these MVP candidates. I will also just throw in there Saquon Barkley. If he has another year like he did last year, you got to put him in the conversation for MVP, even though he probably won't win it because he's a running back. And Derrick Henry, too, is up there as, potential MVP candidate because he was a potential MVP candidate last year as well. But again, it's a quarterback award, so running backs, at least nowadays, are probably not going to get that award. But I definitely wanted to mention both of those guys because they are MVP worthy. All of the guys I mentioned are MVP worthy. So, so that is my MVP candidates that I have. That's basically all quarterbacks with Joe Burrow, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Patrick Mahomes, and Jalen Hurts. Those are the guys that I have listed as my MVP candidates. And, of course, the honorable mentions of Saquon and Derrick Henry as being potential MVP candidates as well if they can continue their success from last season. So that's going to do it for that segment. So when we come back, we've got one more break here. And when we come back, we're going into our final segment. And we're going to dive a little bit into some comments that Deion Sanders made a few days ago in regards to the college football spring game situation. So stick with us. We're going to talk a little bit about that when we come back. All right, so just take this quick break, and we will be right back. All right, guys, welcome back to the show. We are on to our final segment of the show, and this is our College Corner, and we're going to talk a little spring football. A few days ago, over the weekend, I believe, or maybe it was a few days before the weekend, Deion Sanders came out and was basically saying that he was advocating for an actual spring football game as opposed to just scrimmages with within the team. With Florida, you've got the orange and blue game. Every college has some sort of similar thing to that, where it's the red and white game or crimson and white game with Alabama, whatever you want to call it. But they're basically all just scrimmages within the team. But Deion Sanders is basically saying that he would advocate for a regular spring football game, as in the NFL, when you see during the off-season and training camp, they'll run joint practices with teams and before they end up having a preseason game with that team that they've been practicing with. Basically, Deion Sanders is sort of saying that that's what he kind of wants to happen in college football. And I know there are some teams, there are a lot of coaches out there who do not want spring games at all. 19 of the Power 4 college football teams have canceled their spring games so far this year. But they're going to be running, Colorado that is going to be running joint practices and a scrimmage game with Syracuse this spring. Now, Colorado and Syracuse have not actually played each other in decades. It's been a very, very long time since they played each other. But they're going to be having a joint practice and a scrimmage in the off season. And I personally kind of like the idea of the joint practices and scrimmage games with other teams and things like that. I think it's a good way to not only get a feel for teams and what other teams across the country are trying to do and how they're trying to be successful, but you can also kind of get your young players that are looking forward to a career in the NFL, hopefully, if their career goes well. You can kind of get them accustomed to playing an NFL season like that, because if you do spring games and then leading into the college football season, then that's more games. And in the NFL, where they're increasing the amount of time or the amount of games that they're playing in the regular season, and they seemingly are probably going to increase it more so as we go forward, I think this is a good way to kind of, get these young guys prepared for how that's going to be in the NFL, because you see it too many times across the league that these rookies, they'll hit a rookie wall because they're not used to playing this many games of football, this many snaps. In college, you're only playing, if you get to a bowl game or get into the playoffs, you're playing maybe like 12, 13, maybe 14 games, something like that. In the NFL, you're playing 17 games in the regular season, and then, of course, you've got the playoffs. If you make it that far, of course. So that's extra games, and you're working longer, And so I feel like that would kind of get more players kind of accustomed to, playing that sort of schedule, playing that sort of a long season. And it might help them in the long run in their careers. So a lot of people are against it, though, due to, of course, the risk of injury. That's always a risk. But I always, kind of push back on that excuse with a lot of things when it comes to football. We're like, oh, we don't want to do this because it could get somebody hurt or, something like that. And the bottom line is you can get injured anywhere at all. It doesn't necessarily even have to be during a game. You can get injured in practice. You can get injured getting out of the tub in the morning. It's happened before to guys. Where they hurt their ankle or they, land wrong on their foot or on their knee or something like that, and some weird accident and they get injured. And like I said, people get injured in practice all the time, so I don't really necessarily even agree with that argument, because you risk injury every single time that you do the act of playing football. That's just bottom line, But I mean, I get it. You don't want to risk an injury on a, ultimately meaningless game. So I get that part, but you're still having that risk of injury regardless, even if you're in practice, so. But one of the issues that I kind of do sort of understand is a tampering issue, and a lot of coaches are kind of concerned about that. It runs the risk of recruits being taken away from other schools. If you have other schools coming in, they can evaluate your talent and then maybe try and tamper or, legal tampering, and they can maybe try and get that player away from your school and into their program with the transfer portal and NIL deals and all of that goes on nowadays. It's possible for any team to just throw enough money at a player or, a program, and then they can get that player. But few guys have, basically come out against it. Nebraska's head coach is against it. He said the word, and this is just his quote, and I'll just say the full quote here. The word tampering doesn't exist anymore. It's just absolute free, open, common market, he said. And so I don't necessarily want to open up to the outside world. Don't want these guys all being able to watch our guys and say, wow, he looks like a pretty good player. Let's go get him. So that's just kind of what I was just talking about there. That's one of the risks that you have with that. So that's an understandable risk and an understandable concern from head coaches. And, some coaches, of course, have disagreed with that sentiment as well. Clemson head coach Dabo Swinney, he doesn't really believe in that sentiment because he doesn't think that taking away spring games is going to stop tampering. And he might be onto something there. I mean, if teams are looking at a certain guy and want to get a guy to their program, then they're going to do it. They're going to find their way to do it. They don't need to watch them live in a scrimmage situation. They can just watch previous game film, whether that be a young guy, a young recruit, you want to watch his high school film, or if he's a guy that's been on the team for a year or two, you want to watch his previous games and see how he operates on the field. You can still do all of that without spring games, so that's a reasonable argument to make. South Carolina head coach, he chimed in on it too, Shane Beamer. He basically agreed with what Dabo was saying. They don't need to watch a spring game to figure out who's on our team if they are trying to tamper with them and get them. That's what Shane Beamer from South Carolina said. And Texas coach Steve Sarkisian, like I said, a lot of these guys they've spoken up about it. And he's another guy that he doesn't like the idea of the spring games because there are teams out there that play a lot of games as it is. And with Texas, they've played about 30 games in 2 years with all of their success. They've been in the college football playoff the past 2 seasons. And obviously that's a lot of games. But 30 games in 2 years, guess what? That's less than what you play in the NFL, in 2 years. If you're a starter, if you play every single game in the NFL, that's a 17-game season. So that's 34 games that you're playing, in 2 years. So again, that's kind of helping players getting accustomed to an NFL season with that amount of games too. So in a way, playing that many games in 2 years, I could see the people who are against it. I can see that because that's a lot of wear and tear. But at the same time, it could be a good thing because those young players, especially players of teams that are going to the college football playoffs, there's a lot of NFL prospects on those teams. So they want to get themselves accustomed to an NFL season, which is the ultimate goal as a college football player, I would think. And getting in one of those teams and playing all of those games, that will get you accustomed to it. So there's a bright side to that, playing that many games. And many players in the NFL, like I said, they hit a rookie wall at the end of the year. And this would kind of help sort of mitigate some of that, I think, by playing that many games. But like I said, I can see the argument on both sides, why anybody would want and why anybody would not want that. Because with Deion Sanders, his whole idea, I think, is he wants this would be a way to get more attention onto the game as well as bring in more money because you can televise these games just like a preseason game. The NFL makes a lot of money on preseason games too. They get a lot of viewers, especially in that first week when people are craving football. And, this doesn't mean that you have to have 2-3 preseason games or scrimmage games, spring games like that, like the NFL does. But this would at least, put more eyes on your team and, that would generate more money ultimately because you would have networks like CBS and ESPN and all of that would want to cover it. So you could make money that way. So I can understand it. And Deion Sanders, of course, is a pretty solid head coach for Colorado. He's, turned that program from, a 4-win squad to, consistently like an 8-win squad or a team that's, right up there. They're still not national championship contenders or anything like that. But, they're at least better than they were before Deion got there. And Deion's always trying to, make his program better or make his program the best, and he wants to get more eyes so that he can help with recruiting. And I think doing something like this would definitely help with recruiting because you can get more players that see more of your, what you're trying to do, and that'll help bring them into your program. So I totally get why Deion would want it, and again, I get why people would be against it. It's just one of those things, and we'll see if it ever comes to that. There's a lot of college football teams that are canceling spring games for risk of injury, so maybe it doesn't necessarily turn into anything, but Colorado and Syracuse could be the pioneers of this situation of maybe starting a mini sort of preseason sort of thing. It's not even really preseason because it's still several months away from August when football actually kicks off, or September in college. So that is basically what he was talking about, and that is just my thoughts on it overall. I'd be interested to know what you guys' thoughts are on it as well. It's kind of an interesting conversation, an interesting topic that I found just when I was randomly researching certain topics for tonight's show, and I came across that one. So thought it was an interesting topic to talk about, so hopefully you guys enjoyed that. But that is it for tonight's show. Happy Monday, everybody. I'm glad you guys joined me. I'm glad anybody who watches the show, I always appreciate it as well. And once again, if you guys want to contribute to the show in any way, you can, of course, hit the GSMCsports.net, hit the Super Chat feature, and you can type in all of your questions or comments right in there. So thank you once again for tuning in to the GSMC Football Podcast. We are presented, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network, and your support means a lot to us. So please remember to subscribe to the show and leave a positive review. It really does make a difference. So we also invite you to follow us on all of the social medias, Facebook, X, TikTok, and Instagram for more content and updates. Thank you once again, and I hope you guys have a wonderful night, and we'll be right back here, same time tomorrow. So I look forward to joining you guys there. So thank you guys, and you guys have a great night.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go to